Okay, let me just apologize real quick. I am feeling a little bit under the weather, so I don't sound fantastic over here. But the conversation must go on with yet again another PlayStation 6 release timeline discussion. That's been going on a lot lately based on a few other people voicing their concerns in the business and in the gaming sphere as well. You know, Scott DeWaz talking about it, John on his channel for Spawn Wave, and many others. There's a lot that has been said about next gen and the possibility of it being delayed. More so because we also had an article come out from Sandstone Insights, which is an analyst firm in Japan. So bear in mind, this is not necessarily a direct rumor, but it is something where this article came up. It's paywalled, written by David Gibson, who is an analyst. And the big headline here for the key points on the article says, quote, PlayStation lifecycle extended. Sony expects the PS5's lifecycle to be extended, and the PS6's release is likely to be delayed longer than many expected. Now, just to clarify, I don't believe that's a sourced rumor necessarily. I think that's more opinion based on the analyst firm. So it's not exactly something where we can say, based on just speculation alone, that that's really what's going on, although reasonably speaking, Sony is considering all their options, as we heard from one article from Tom Henderson writing for Insider Gaming, that the console manufacturers are looking at the current landscape, the global economic crisis, the RAM prices, the tariffs. I mean, there's so many things going on that are going to greatly affect the electronic components that are used to build these machines. And, well, at that point, consoles can't be too expensive because then it doesn't really make sense for consumers or Sony to be selling a console that is too expensive. But having said that, the ongoing rumor, as we've discussed for a long time, has been that PlayStation 6 is going to launch holiday 2027, which would fit with the typical 7-year timeline, and that seems pretty long, but that's sort of what we've been used to since the PlayStation 3 days. Prior to that, console generations were 4 to 5 years. So that's already kind of long, but that has been the norm for 3 console generations. And yet the overwhelming majority, anecdotally as it sounds, I haven't seen anybody say otherwise, that they would be totally fine with waiting until 2028 or longer in some cases for PlayStation 6. The overall sentiment does seem to be that we don't need PlayStation 6 by holiday 2027. And, you know, that's because, again, like we've said this much before, we've had a sort of 2-year delay baked in with the whole COVID scenario and the supply issues. Games take forever to make. I mean, typically 5, 6, 7-year dev cycles based on some of your favorite studios. They still might not have put out a brand new game during this console generation. So the argument I always make there is that it's based on a studio by studio thing because there's just so many things coming out. To me, it feels like we've got nothing but plenty of good things to play, but that's part of it, right? Is that, oh, I'm fine with waiting until PlayStation 6 because there's still a huge backlog. I still want more games from my favorite studios. I just bought a PlayStation 5 Pro. There's more upside there, enjoying that console for the time being, which is still pretty expensive at initially $700, now $750. But putting all that aside, here's where I stand on the whole thing, right? I'm a little bit conflicted. I mean, I'm not 100% on board with the idea of, oh, let's just wait until 2028, possibly longer than that. I mean, to get more particular, 2028 seems maybe the best compromise in my view. When you start thinking 2029, 2030, that's where it's just too long in my opinion, but that's also primarily based on the idea that the longer we go, that means the spec sheet that PlayStation 6 is currently rumored to have, that's already locked in, which, mind you, there is a rumor out there for PS6 specs that was from Tom over on their channel Moore's Law is Dead about it having 54 RDNA 5 CUs. It's going to be 8 Zen 6 C cores, 2 Zen 6 low power cores, and then 40 gigabytes of RAM based on existing pricing, but that was pre-RAM apocalypse, essentially. Yeah, there's a number of specs that we can go over, and that's all rumored. But whether that's true or not, whatever the specs are, they were locked in conceivably because we all know consoles are made over a long period of time. These are long-term contracts and an R&D process that Sony has with AMD, which they've been actually quite public with. That's the AMD collaboration, Project Amethyst. So not just all these different AI upscaling methods that are birthed out of that program, and we're seeing that with FSR4, with PSSR 2.0, but all these more recent things that they've discussed, like Radiant Cores. They've said many public things which are going to be key pillars of next-gen hardware. We know PlayStation 6 has been in development, and assuming the tape-out rumor is correct, which tape-out is that period where once that's finished, that's finalizing the chipset for PlayStation 6. That's the actual SoC that Sony intends on sending to manufacturing. We are allegedly past that point. So PlayStation 6 has been R&D'd and made for all intents and purposes. That's part of why initially I thought this would be the year that, oh, this is it. Like, we're going to see PS6 dev kits, because this process is just too far ahead now at this point. That's not to say Sony can't delay PlayStation 6. But, when you do that, there's so many downsides to doing that based on where you are in that process. You've already got the chipset designed. You can sit on that, but you can't sit on that for too long. That's the thing about consoles. It's an upside and downside in that it's a closed box. Everything's set in stone. It's always great for studios that can target that hardware specifically. They can extract a lot out of the hardware. That's always been the really cool upside of consoles, but they are locked in. So to delay it and sit on it for that long, I honestly, at that point, I'm fine with getting PlayStation 6 as soon as we reasonably can, if that's the chipset PS6 is going to have. You can't just redesign all that. Now you could, but that's the thing. If Sony's going to completely R&D and make a brand new chipset for PlayStation 6, and that means basically moving over to RDNA 6, Navi 7, I mean, at that point, based on the AMD product roadmap, you would maybe want PlayStation 6 to come out in the 2030s, like some people are boldly saying that they'd be happy waiting with. And if that was the case, then cool, let's do 2030. But I don't think Sony is going to do that. This is a very expensive process of building and planning out a whole new console generation. So they are in that process right now where everything's sort of locked in. I mean, I'm not even going to humor the idea of if they were able to lock in certain component prices for RAM, because crucially that's the component, that and storage, that's going to, possibly eat up a lot of any sort of margin Sony had on the system. And realistically, consoles always had a loss-leading model for mostly Sony and Microsoft. They tend to lose money right away on those consoles. But they don't want to lose too much. They're not looking to go back to historic PS3 lows, where they're losing $200 on the bill of material on every machine that they do sell. Even though, as a side tangent, they absolutely could do that because they make substantially more money nowadays from PlayStation Network. This generation that we're in right now is incredibly profitable. PS5 has done exponentially better than the PS2, PS3, and even PlayStation 4. They're making more money than they ever have, and it's primarily from network services. That's PlayStation Network, MTX, Season Passes, PlayStation Plus. Conceivably, they can sort of work through this crisis, but, they're a public company. They're still going to be deeply concerned with not losing too much money on hardware, especially if maybe the demand isn't there. Because that's the other aspect of the conversation. It's still a lot of people in the enthusiast space talking about this. That's why, anecdotally, it seems like everybody's totally fine waiting with PlayStation 6. At the same time, there's so many other people that are not watching these videos and keeping up with gaming forums and articles on IGN and these enthusiast forums like NeoGAF and Recent Era. Like, there's so many people that don't know anything about that stuff. And if PlayStation 6 is announced and releases holiday 2027 and it's not obscenely expensive, I am more than certain that console would probably do pretty well. Now, that might seem like a bold statement when gaming is a luxury and everything around us is getting expensive, groceries, utilities, housing. So I can totally see why some would think if it comes out next year during the holidays, maybe you're not that convinced that PS6 would sell that well. I'm still of the opinion that based on numbers we have right now, with the average selling price for this console being higher than PlayStation 4 on a launch line basis, and it's still selling as well as PlayStation 4, that sort of tells me that people are going to buy PlayStation 6. If it's there, if it's available, if it's not too expensive, people will buy it. They're still fairly accustomed to upgrading their technology. I think the whole yearly smartphone thing really changed consumer habits a long time ago. So with PS5 being around since 2020, I don't think it would have an issue selling by late 2027. All this to say, if it's delayed, I just am of the opinion that if it's delayed by only a modest amount, that's fine. If it's delayed longer than that, I would want new hardware because I would want a reasonable gap between what we have right now and what we're going to get. You know what I mean? That's the other issue. Everyone's sort of wondering, well, why would we even need it when the jump might not be that realistic? Well, it's so funny, too, because I think a lot of you might remember a lot of the PS5 Pro conversations we had prior to that console being revealed and being official. I was actually of the opinion that we might not even have a PS5 Pro because of just that. The sort of gap that we're seeing between these console generations and mid-step generations. Like, just because we had PS4 Pro doesn't necessarily mean we should have a PS5 Pro, because with diminishing returns, you kind of want a reasonable gap between hardware so that there's a reason to jump to a new cycle, you know what I mean? I still feel like we could have skipped PS5 Pro. Now, having it still, it makes sense in the case that we have PSSR, so with that being an ML solution, it can really pave the way for PSSR on a next-gen console, and over time we're seeing it improve and get better, especially because early on we've had some growing pains with PS5 Pro and PSSR. So it does have its place. It's just, it's hard to justify it in the same way that PS4 Pro is justified in 2016 with the mass adoption of 4K televisions. But the point still stood back then of like, I'm not sure if we really needed that console when it might seem very expensive. Turns out it was very expensive. And it just eats away at that power gap of what a PS6 can do and how it can define itself between PS5, because we're in diminishing returns. So that's my point, is that if we delay the system, if we're expecting a delay, I don't want it to really be that long. Otherwise, if it's the same SoC, I would prefer to just have it as soon as, not as soon as possible, but you know what I mean. I would prefer it on the same timeline. Otherwise, it's like, if we're not going to delay it and do a whole new SoC, which I think is unrealistic, by the way, just so we're clear, I don't think that's going to happen. I think what Sony has R&D'd, what they've built and taped out with AMD, is PlayStation 6. So since that is mostly set in stone, I would prefer to have that on the original timeline if they can reasonably still offer it at a price that's not too obscene. Because that's the thing, I don't want it to be crazy expensive, and I still don't expect it will be more expensive than PlayStation 5 Pro currently. I think they've already sort of reached that ceiling of like, ooh, with a console price tag, we can't be touching that unless it's a low volume Pro console. PS6 is supposed to be a high volume next gen box, so you can't touch that high price tag even in the landscape that we're in. But all that said, I still think we're probably getting it holiday 2027, because that's where we are. They've taped out the SoC and everything's kind of set in stone. I do not know anything about what kind of contracts they may or may not have secured, whatever sort of pricing agreements they have for RAM and storage. We're all speculating, but I think based on what we know and how public Sony has been about what is very clearly PlayStation 6, they're kind of just full gas here. And it's hard to pump the brakes. I think if you do pump the brakes, you're only stopping it for possibly a year, maybe two, which at that point the upside has to be that it's just for their margins. So they don't put themselves in a very difficult spot of selling a very expensive console. It cannot be super, super expensive. It's really more on them to decide with the current SoC that they have what they're willing to do or what they're willing to lose. But I don't know. That's me being on the soapbox about everything we know about the system so far. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.